Life under Roman occupation was tough. It was a time of mixed feelings. People woke up every day knowing they weren't fully in charge of their own lives. A foreign power called the Romans made the rules. This was the world Jesus lived in, and it's good to understand that. You see, the Romans didn't just show up overnight. They had been around for a while. They took over Judea in 63 BC. That's a long time before Jesus was born, and once they were there, they stayed. They called it Pax Romana, Roman peace. But for the people living in Judea, it often didn't feel very peaceful. It felt like control, the constant Roman presence. Imagine walking down a street in Jerusalem or Nazareth. You would see Roman soldiers. They wore their armor, they carried their weapons. They were always there. Maybe they were patrolling, maybe they were standing guard at a fort or a government building. Their presence was a constant reminder. It told everyone who was really in charge. These soldiers were often from different parts of the Roman Empire. They weren't usually locals, so they didn't really understand Jewish customs or traditions, and sometimes they didn't care. They were there to keep order. They were there to make sure the Roman laws were followed. And Rome built things. They were master builders, they built roads, and these roads were for them. They moved their troops, they moved their goods, but locals used them too, of course. They also built impressive buildings, big aqueducts to carry water. These were signs of their power and their civilization. But for many Jews, these grand structures just highlighted how foreign their rulers were. You might see Roman eagles or other symbols. These were on banners, on coins, on buildings. To the Romans, these were symbols of their greatness. But for the Jews, who worshipped one god and avoided idols, these symbols could be offensive. They represented a pagan empire. They represented everything that wasn't Jewish. The heavy hand of taxation. One of the biggest ways Rome impacted daily life was through taxes. And these weren't small taxes. There were many kinds of taxes. There was a land tax. If you owned land, you paid tax on it. There was a poll tax, a head tax. Everyone had to pay it just for being alive. You paid taxes on what you sold at the market. You paid customs duties if you transported goods. And these taxes often felt like a heavy burden. Imagine you're a farmer. You work hard all year. You plant your crops. You hope for good rain. You harvest your grain or your grapes. And then a big portion of what you've worked for goes to the Romans. It's not for your community. It's not for your family. It's for an empire far away. And who collected these taxes? Well, often they were collected by people called publicans. These were local Jews who worked for the Romans. They were basically tax collectors, but they didn't just collect the official amount. The Roman system allowed them to collect extra. They made their money by taking more than what was required. So a publican might be tasked with collecting a certain amount for Rome, but then he'd add his own commission on top. This made them very rich, and it made them very hated. Think about it. Your neighbor, someone from your own people, is making himself wealthy by taking your money and giving it to the foreign occupiers. People saw them as traitors. They were shunned. This helps you understand why Jesus eating with tax collectors was such a big deal. It was shocking. The taxes weren't just a financial burden. They were also a constant source of humiliation. Every time you paid, you were reminded who was in charge. You were reminded that your hard work was fueling their empire, not your own people's freedom. It drove many people into poverty. It drove many into debt. If you couldn't pay your taxes, you could lose your land. You could even be forced to sell yourself or your children into slavery. It was a harsh reality. Society and everyday life. The Roman occupation created layers in society. At the very top, you had the Roman governor and his staff. They lived well. They had power. Below them were the local elite. These were wealthy Jews, often from important families like the Herodians or some of the Sadducees. They had to navigate a tricky path. They needed to cooperate with Rome to keep their own positions and wealth. But they also needed to maintain some standing with their own people. It was a balancing act. Then you had the vast majority of people. These were the common folk. Farmers, fishermen, carpenters, merchants, laborers. They lived simple lives. They worked hard. They struggled. They were the ones who felt the taxes the most. They were the ones who saw the soldiers every day. They were the ones hoping for a change. And there were slaves. Slavery was common in the Roman world. Some people were born into it. Some were captured in war. Some sold themselves or their children into it out of desperation. Life was different in the cities compared to the countryside. Cities like Jerusalem, Sepphoris, or Tiberias often had more Roman influence. You might see Roman-style buildings, Roman baths, even theaters or amphitheaters. These were places where Roman culture was more visible. The local elite might adopt some Roman ways, speaking Greek, wearing Roman clothing. But in the villages and the countryside, life was more traditional. People clung to their Jewish customs. They spoke Aramaic, their everyday language. They followed their ancient laws and traditions. This was where the heart of Jewish life really beat, away from the direct glare of Roman influence. And food was basic. Bread was the staple. You'd eat olives, figs, dates, lentils, maybe some fish if you lived near the Sea of Galilee. Meat was a luxury usually reserved for festivals. Homes were simple, often made of mud brick or stone with flat roofs. Her families were large and they lived closely together. Life was about community, about family, and about faith. But even these basic things were affected. Roman laws could dictate what you could or couldn't do, where you could go. The soldiers might demand housing or food if they were passing through a village. The Romans had a very clear system of law, and their punishments were brutal. If you broke Roman law, you faced Roman justice, and it was designed to be a deterrent. It was designed to make people afraid. One of the most terrifying punishments was crucifixion. This was a Roman method of execution. It was public, it was slow, it was agonizing, and it was meant to send a clear message: don't mess with Rome. Criminals, rebels, and runaway slaves were often crucified. It was a symbol of Roman power and a warning against rebellion. You can imagine the horror this instilled in people. It also helps you understand the shock and terror when Jesus was condemned to crucifixion. It wasn't just a death, it was a statement. Floggings, beatings, and other forms of public humiliation were also common. They were meant to break a person's spirit and to warn others. Roman prefects, like Pontius Pilate, had the power of life and death. They could order these punishments without much oversight. Jewish law, as practiced by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish High Court, still existed. But its power was limited. The Sanhedrin could deal with many internal Jewish matters, like religious disputes. But when it came to capital punishment, the death penalty, they usually needed Roman approval. This is important to remember when you read about Jesus' trial. The Jewish leaders condemned him, but they had to bring him to Pilate for the final sentence of execution. And the Romans kept a close eye on the Jewish leadership. They appointed the high priest, or at least confirmed the appointment. They wanted someone who would cooperate, someone who wouldn't stir up trouble. This meant the religious leaders often found themselves in a difficult position, trying to balance their faith and their people's needs with the demands of their Roman overlords. Clash of religions and cultures. This was perhaps the deepest source of conflict. The Romans were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. They had Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and countless others. They also practiced emperor worship. They believed their emperors were divine, or at least had divine approval. This was a core part of their identity and their political system. But the Jews were strictly monotheistic. They believed in one God, Yahweh, and their faith forbade worshiping any other gods. It forbade idols. It strictly forbade worshiping a human emperor. This wasn't just a preference, it was a core commandment, the first of the 10 Commandments. So when Roman symbols appeared in Judea, like the eagle or the image of the emperor on coins, it was deeply offensive to many Jews. It was seen as idolatry. There were many protests and clashes over this. For example, there were times when Roman governors tried to put images of the emperor in the temple in Jerusalem. This caused massive riots and outrage. The temple was the holiest place in Judaism. It was unthinkable to defile it with pagan images. King Herod, who ruled Judea as a client king for Rome before and during Jesus' early life, was a master of trying to bridge these two worlds. He was Jewish by heritage, but he was very Roman in his tastes. He built grand cities like Caesarea Maritima with a Roman port, theaters, and temples to Roman gods. He even rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, making it magnificent, perhaps to win favor with the Jews, but also to show off his own power and Roman-style grandeur. But even Herod, with all his building and his attempts to balance things, was never fully accepted by many Jews. He was seen as a puppet of Rome, a half-Jew, a traitor to their traditions. His sons, like Herod Antipas, who ruled Galilee during Jesus' ministry, continued this difficult legacy. The clash wasn't just about big religious symbols, it was about everyday practices. The Roman soldiers didn't understand why Jews wouldn't eat certain foods. They didn't understand the Sabbath, a day of rest when no work was done. These differences led to misunderstandings, insults, and sometimes violence. It was a constant source of friction, resistance, and rebellion. Given all this, it's no surprise that there was a strong spirit of resistance among the Jewish people. And they had a long history of fighting for their freedom from the time of the Maccabees. And they believed that God would one day deliver them from foreign rule. One prominent group was the Zealots. These were revolutionaries. They believed in active resistance, even armed rebellion, to overthrow Roman rule. They believed God would help them if they fought for their freedom. Simon the Zealot, one of Jesus' disciples, probably came from this background. They were willing to use violence to achieve their goals. Their presence shows how deep the desire for freedom ran. But there were other forms of resistance too. Some chose to withdraw, like the Essenes, living in isolated communities and waiting for God's intervention. Others, like many Pharisees, focused on strict adherence to Jewish law, believing that faithfulness to God would ultimately lead to deliverance. They believed that if all of Israel truly followed God's laws, God would act. And there were many, many people who hoped for a Messiah. This was a powerful expectation. They believed God would send a chosen leader, a king, to free them from Roman rule, restore Israel's independence, and usher in a new era of peace and justice. This Messiah was often envisioned as a warrior king, like King David, who would drive out the oppressors. This is a crucial piece of context for understanding Jesus' ministry. When people called Jesus son of David, they were often thinking of a political liberator. The Romans were always aware of this potential for rebellion. They kept a large military force in Judea. Any sign of unrest was met with swift and brutal force. There were frequent uprisings, sometimes small local revolts, sometimes larger ones. These were always crushed, and many lives were lost. The greatest of these, the Jewish War, would eventually lead to the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple in 70 AD, just a few decades after Jesus' time. The Jewish leadership navigating a tightrope, the Jewish leaders, the high priest, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the members of the Sanhedrin focus were in a very difficult position. They had to operate under Roman authority. They had to maintain some kind of order among their own people. They had to preserve their traditions, and they had to do all this without provoking Rome too much. The Sadducees, who were often wealthy and held priestly power, tended to be more conservative and more willing to cooperate with Rome. They wanted to maintain the status quo, protect the temple, and preserve their own positions. They feared anything that might upset the Romans and lead to greater repression. The Pharisees were more focused on the law, on everyday righteousness, and on teaching the people. They often clashed with the Sadducees and with the Roman authorities over matters of tradition and purity. They were often critical of Rome, but they generally didn't advocate for armed rebellion. They believed in God's power, but through faithfulness, not necessarily through violence. These leaders were constantly walking a tightrope. They had to keep their people from rebelling too openly, which would lead to Roman retaliation. But they also had to preserve their Jewish identity and traditions. It was a no-win situation sometimes. Their decisions, like the decision to turn Jesus over to Pilate, must be understood within this complex political and social context. They feared that Jesus' popularity and his talk of a new kingdom might be seen by Rome as a threat, leading to even more severe Roman crackdowns on the Jewish people. If we let him go on like this, they said, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation. This was a genuine fear. Everyday people's perspective. So, what did all this mean for the everyday person? It meant living with a lot of fear. Fear of the soldiers, fear of the tax collectors, fear of Roman punishments. It meant living with uncertainty. Would there be another uprising? Would Rome crack down harder? It also meant living with a deep sense of injustice. They saw their land occupied, they saw their money taken, they saw their traditions disrespected. They saw foreign gods honored while their own God's name was often disregarded by the rulers. But it also meant living with hope. The hope for a Messiah was very real. It was a lifeline. People clung to the ancient prophecies. They believed that God would not abandon them forever. They looked for signs. They listened to prophets and teachers. Life was hard, but people still went about their daily lives. They married, they had children, they worked their farms, they prayed in their synagogues. They celebrated their festivals. They found strength in their families and their communities. They found meaning in their faith. The stories of Jesus, the parables he told, the miracles he performed, the messages he preached, they all took place in this world. When Jesus talked about giving to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's, it was directly addressing the tension of Roman taxation. When he spoke of a different kind of kingdom, not of this world, it was in stark contrast to the political kingdom everyone was yearning for. When he healed the sick and ate with outcasts like tax collectors, he was challenging the social norms and the religious purity laws that were so prevalent in that time. His message of love, forgiveness, and a kingdom not built on earthly power or military might was radical in this environment. It was spoken to people who were oppressed, who were looking for a savior, who were tired of the conflict and the control. Conclusion, life under Roman occupation was complex and challenging. It was a time of tension between Jewish tradition and Roman power. It was a time of economic hardship due to heavy taxation. It was a time of social stratification and cultural clashes. And it was a time of both active and passive resistance, fueled by a deep yearning for freedom and the hope of a Messiah. Understanding this backdrop helps us truly grasp the power and the context of the Gospels. It helps us see why Jesus' words resonated so deeply with some and challenged others so profoundly. It helps us understand the choices people made, the hopes they held, and the daily struggles they faced. It was a world waiting for change, a world looking for a different kind of king. And that's the world Jesus walked into, bringing a message that was both familiar and revolutionary, right in the middle of all that Roman control.